The South African Federation of Trade Unions says it rejects the Electricity Amendment Regulation Bill, which was passed in Parliament on Thursday. The bill seeks to provide, amongst others, an open market platform that will allow for competitive electricity trading in South Africa. So it's also aimed at strengthening the role of the National Energy Regulator of South Africa to include powers to license entities that will implement the competitive market and have regulatory oversight during the transition to a competitive market. So Mineral Resources and Energy Minister Gwede Mantashe says the bill will radically transform the structure of the electricity sector for the better. However, SAFTU differs. To take this discussion, in fact, further, we're joined via video link by SAFTU spokesperson Trevor Shaku to unpack further. Trevor, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here on the SABC at this hour.
Good afternoon, Lizel, and thanks for having us.
Trevor, the ERA, Electricity Amendment Regulation Bill, sparking questions about the equitable distribution of costs, amongst many other issues. Why are you against the bill?
Look, we're against the bill because, in summary, it seeks to bring competition and liberalize the energy markets. Secondly, it seeks to change the amount, or rather the ownership structure of those particular entities that are going to be providing electricity to the people, but also it seeks to guarantee the entities that will be involved in the energy generation profit. So in other words, we're looking at how it seeks to change the market structure and bringing independent power producers to produce a lot of electricity. For instance, if you look at the presentation made by the ESCOM to the Presidential Climate Commission last year, it shows that by 2035, they want to have reduced the amount of electricity that is generated by ESCOM to 33%. In other words, the rest of the electricity capacity will be generated through private proprietors. And in this instance, we know that it will be independent power producers. But the second thing is that they want to bring what they call risk-return-oriented tariff. In other words, they want to guarantee those independent power producers who will enter the market of generation the ability, or rather the capacity, for them to be able to make profit and incentivize them. They say that it would be a market in which, for instance, the investors in the private energy generation will be guaranteed of return that is commensurate with the risks of their investments. In other words, it will be commensurate with the amount of money that they invest, and that guarantees them of profit. So the South African Federation of Trade Unions is against this bill because it introduced risk-return-oriented tariff, which in our view, as I've explained, will guarantee profits. But in guaranteeing profits, it means that it may actually lead to the prices of electricity increasing, and thus increasing energy poverty. And in the context of liberalizing the energy market, we are concerned because it would change the ownership structure in the energy generation division.
Okay, so Trevor, thank you for that. So you've definitely spoken to the issue of returns commensurate with the risk. And you've also spoken to the issue from your vantage point with regards to independent power producers, also because we're obviously trying to understand the political economy of electricity and the politics of electricity distribution. So with ESCOM set to increase tariffs by 12.74% from the 1st of April, what's your take? It's above inflation. So ultimately, we have to look at the impact it's going to have on consumers, the rising costs of living, and the knock-on effects. Break that down for us as well.
Sure. So in relation to the increase to the electricity tariff as accepted by NERSA, we are worried because the working class currently is already dealing with the high cost of living, which is reflected in the increase of interest rates to 11.75, the prime lending rate. It is reflected in the increase of food. If you check the food inflation by Statistics South Africa, you'll see that it has been elevated above 13% for the past 2 years. It is reflected in the increase of fuel and transport because, of course, fuel has ripple effects. It will contribute to the price of other goods in the economy increasing because it is also factored as an input cost to those particular enterprises that are in the circulation of goods, retailers, wholesalers, and other companies, of course, that are downstream in the value chain. So if you look at this, you realize that the amount of money that workers have to spend on necessities such as food, electricity, water, transport, and fuel are already at elevated state. And if you factor in the 12.74% that has been approved by NERSA, this is just going to add to the burden. And if you calculate it over the period of 17 years, you realize that with adjusted inflation, or rather adjusted to inflation, it would actually lead to, lead us to conclude that electricity has increased by between 312 and 314% over the 17 years period. Because in 2007, 1 unit of electricity was sold for 37 cents, and today it is sold for 1 rand 97 cents. And if you factor in the 12.74%, it will actually go beyond 2 rand. So that on its own shows that the electricity will be more expensive, but also will contribute to the rising cost of living, which is actually overburdening the working people and their households.
And Trevor, just on the back of that, because Mineral Resources and Energy Minister Gwede Mantashe is saying that it will radically transform the structure of the electricity sector. Talk to us about the regulator then itself. How so, if so, in fact, will it strengthen or not strengthen the role of NASA at large to include powers to license the entities? I mean, what are your thoughts on that during this transition? But also I want to look at the solutions on the cards, alternatives, just from SAFTU's point of view as well. Is a paradigm shift needed? And if so, what is that alternative looking like, just as we conclude?
Sure. So maybe let me start with our solution. Our solution is premised on a public pathway. We would have wanted to retain the energy market and structure as it is at the current moment, where Eskom is a monopoly and is a vertically integrated entity which would have generation, transmission, and distribution. If you have and retain such a particular structure of our energy generation and energy provision in this country, it would mean that you do not need the TSO, the transmission system operator, which is brought into the structure to ensure that the liberalization is actually given a proper framework. Because what the TSO will be doing, in our view, will not be necessarily strengthening the energy markets, but what it's going to do, it is just to match the current reforms which are being introduced in the energy market, so that the IPPs will no longer go into contracts with Eskom, but that the IPPs will sell their electricity to the transmission operator through the central purchasing agency. And the central purchasing agency will then be the one that is selling, or rather distributing, the electricity to the people and the consumers, the end users in the main. So there is nothing in our view that actually gives credence to what Gwede Mantashe is saying, because Minister Gwede is merely saying this is going to improve because he's looking at the fact that the reforms that are being effected by introduction of independent power producers in the energy generation market only can correspond to an establishment of the transmission system operator. So in that instance, it does not necessarily guarantee that there's going to be an improvement. In our view, actually, we think that there's going to be changes, and these changes in the short and long term might even be detrimental. We've demonstrated that in the short term, if you look at the tariff 12.74%, which we discussed in the last segment, if you look at it, 21.6% of that is actually going to meet costs which are going into IPP's requests. So already IPPs are contributing to the increase in tariffs. But secondly, if you look in the long term, you have the market, the tendency of these institutions, or rather business enterprises, to concentrate and centralize. This, in our view, is going to eventually lead to oligopolies, monopolies in the generation market. And as a result, we're not going to enjoy the so-called downward pressure on prices, as they are saying. I mean, the presumed consequence of this process is that we're going to enjoy lower prices because more generators in the energy generation market are going to cause prices of electricity to go down. We think that is not true, and history tells us that we are not going to actually benefit out of what we are told we are going to benefit
Trevor,
because of what we have seen already happening with IPPs.
Yeah, the conversation obviously continues from here into. For now, we'll leave it there. Thank you for weighing in. Trevor Shaku, in fact, SAFTU spokesperson, really just speaking to SAFTU's stance, rejecting the ERA bill, the Electricity Amendment Regulation Bill, just on the back of Eskom, of course, set to increase tariffs in April. We're looking at, the implications at large for consumers.